Hello and welcome back to Totally Rad Guitars. In this episode, we'll be checking out the JCM900. In this case, the Dual Reverb, and I have a reissue from 2013 here. This is probably one of the most hated Marshall amps online. There's a lot of people saying that they really hate it for whatever reason, and then there's a lot of people saying that they really like it or it sounds really good. It's probably the most divisive, at least top of the line Marshall amp that's out. And something interesting about it, it was introduced in 1990 and ran basically continuously all the way up to present. The initial run, I believe, ended around 1999, but in some markets you could still get brand new JCM900 dual reverbs even after the JCM2000 series came out. So the Mark III model, which I reviewed in a previous video, that one only ran from 1990 to 92. There might be a few that made it into 93, but by 93 they'd switched that model over to the SLX, which was an all-tube sort of variant on the same circuit design. The SLX ran all the way up until 1999 and has not been reissued, which is kind of funny to me because that's probably the most popular or well-liked JCM900 series amplifier, but this one though, the reissues came out almost immediately after production ended. I've seen reissues with serial numbers starting from 2005 or 2006. This particular one is from 2013, and if you really like it, you can buy a brand new one right now for the low price of $3,000, which is pretty crazy to me considering how unpopular they are online, but there are tons and tons of these used. The original run and the reissues, they seem to be selling pretty well, or at least they're popular enough that Marshall has seen fit to continue reissuing it for a really long time. I personally think it's a really good sounding amp, but it sort of depends on the type of sound that you're going for. It's not really a traditional Marshall type sound. It's got more gain, it's a little bit brighter, and you know, a lot of people complain about the solid state nature of this amp, and that is something that we're going to talk about here in this video because there's a lot of misconceptions about it. Like, I've seen tons of forum posts and people online saying stuff like, oh, I had my tech remove the diodes from my 900 and now it sounds great, or oh, I only use channel A because channel A doesn't have diodes, and all that stuff is wrong, first of all. But this one, it is a little bit more of a complicated circuit, so again, I had to print it out just to make sure that I don't say anything wrong, but it's a little bit different from what I usually look at in these circuits. Usually it's pretty simple. You know, you go through a couple of tube gain stages, maybe a few other tube functions, and there might be diodes or something along the way, like in the Mark III video where they're controlled by their own separate knob, which I think is a really cool feature that they should have done on these amps. Well, when we look at this design, you'll see there are a ton of these really big triangle shapes. That triangle is an op amp, which is basically a little miniature solid state device that can be used to increase the level of something, like well, basically you could use them in lieu of like real gain stages, and a lot of overdrive pedals and stuff have them, you know, like Tube Screamers have them, Boss SD1, Big Muff, there's, you know, tons and tons of pedals that have some sort of op amp driver with a diode clipping stage after it. And that's actually how this amp is designed. It's basically a giant distortion pedal with a lot of shaping and stuff going on. So to go over the basic features, you have two channels. There's channel A and channel B. Channel B is sort of the higher gain one. The gain on that one goes from 0 to 20. Channel A just goes from 0 to 10 like a regular Marshall. Then there's a shared EQ. So both channels have the same treble, middle, bass, and presence controls. And then there's separate volumes per channel and separate reverb levels per channel. This amp actually has a spring reverb in it that I think actually sounds really good. I know some people who are really, really intense reverb experts may not agree, but I think it sounds pretty nice. And the foot switch jack is right here on the front. There's also an effects loop on the back and the usual assortment of stuff. Although it is kind of worth mentioning, I guess, that the effects loop idea was still pretty new in 1990 when these came out. So You know, the JCM 2205 and 2210 split channel 800 amps had effects loop, but it wasn't necessarily that common at the time. But the 900 series, every amp in the 900 series has an effects loop. And there's another thing, we'll talk about that when we get to the circuit and the sound test. So I think the most important thing to note about the circuit design is channel A follows this path that goes in, and the gain control here is connected to an op amp with a bunch of LED clippers on it. And LEDs, the way they work, I described clipping diodes in my Mark III video, where any voltage above a certain amount basically gets, you know, clipped off at a threshold depending on how the diodes are actually set up. And the LEDs don't work quite that way. LEDs have like a softer clipping dynamic. They do clip, but they clip at lower voltages and more progressively, so it sounds a little bit more like a natural overdrive. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people mistakenly say that channel A doesn't have diodes in this amp, because it is harder to tell if you really listen for that sort of diode, sort of, you know, it's got like a grit to it. It's kind of hard to describe, I guess, but the channel A doesn't have quite that same sort of grit to the diode clipping. And another, you know, famous amp that used diode clipping with LEDs would be the rhythm channel on the Marshall Silver Jubilee. So, you know, that amp was really well received, and I think a lot of people point to the success of the Jubilee as one of the reasons why, oh, you know, the Jubilee has diodes too, so the 900 dual reverb is, you know, falsely maligned, you know, and there is some truth to that, but again, the diode clipping isn't the problem. If you just clip the diodes out of channel A and you just ran a wire in that circuit instead of an actual, you know, series of LEDs, it still wouldn't really change the tone of the amp all that much. It definitely would have an effect, but you're still getting the bulk of your drive from the op amp stages. So this amp, when you look at the specs at first glance, it looks like a standard kind of Marshall fare. You have 4 power tubes. In this case, I have 5881s. Because that's what these came with originally. Very early JCM900s in the original run would have had EL34s. Then they switched to 5881s about partway through, then went back to EL34s at the very end, and then back to 5881s again when the reissues came out. And then it has 3 12AX7 or ECC83 preamp tubes, just like any normal Marshall. Sounds like a JCM900 or something like that. But the difference is, on this amp, there is only one tube gain stage, and that's V1A. So V1A is a tube gain stage shared by both channels. All of the other gain from this amp comes from op amps and clipping. So there's only one stage. There's not even an input stage. Technically, the input gain stage is handled by op amps as well. So it's a gain stage that's a little bit further in the signal path. And then V1B is the tone stack driver, just like a normal Marshall. And then V2A is the effects loop return, basically level control. It's a buffer. And then V2B is the reverb return recovery stage driver. And then V3 is the phase inverter, both sides, obviously, to each pair of power gram tubes. And that's another reason why I think when you put the, and I'll do it in this video, I'll put this little cable here in the effects loop and just jumper it basically. And there is a tonal difference, but it is a pretty minor one. I think people might be overselling that. And this is also another amp. Not only are there a lot of mods and people motivated to do mods on this amp, but this has got to be the amp that I most see recommendations to put an EQ in the effects loop. And that's fine. If you love the tone and the feel of the amp and you want to add an effects, you know, EQ in the loop, then you can definitely get some great tonal shaping. If you boost the mids a little bit, maybe cut the treble down a little, you could probably approximate a more traditional Marshall sound, no problem. But my attitude with that is I have a 31 band rack EQ, and you know, one time I sat here and I spent you know, like 6 hours just tweaking each little band of that 31 band EQ. And I feel like you could almost make any amp sound like anything. So if you have a 900 and you like the tone, then don't worry about it. If you add an EQ for like a little bump for solos or a slightly different tone, you know, just enjoy it, be happy. Don't let anybody on the internet, you know, stupid comments about diode clipping or whatever get to you. It really doesn't matter that much. If you like the tone, then enjoy it. But if you own a JCM900 and you really want JCM800 tone and someone says, oh, just throw an EQ in the loop, well, it might work temporarily, but I think you're probably setting yourself up for disappointment, where you would probably rather get just an 800 or, you know, something else anyway. So just something to keep in mind. And the other thing is I paid about $650 for this amp. And I feel really bad for whoever paid $3,000 for this and then traded it in to Guitar Center for me to get for 650 bucks. I mean, that's just a crazy price to me, but I mean, all the prices are really high, so that's sort of expected. But I think even a JCM800 2203 reissue is cheaper than that, so why wouldn't you get the 2203? And I think a Silver Jubilee is $2,000. It's a whole $1,000 cheaper. I'd find it hard to recommend this amp over any of those other amps if we're speaking strictly of buying them new. And I know obviously you have to buy new amps in order for there to be used amps for people like me to buy, but there's no way it cost $3,000 to produce this amp. Maybe I'm just out of my mind or whatever, but it's mostly op amps and stuff. I don't know how hard the circuit is to put together, but you know, if people stop buying them new, then maybe Marshall would lower the price a little, make it more reasonable. I don't know. It's not my department. So let's hear how it sounds. I'm playing a Kramer Pacer Custom 2. This one's from like 88-ish. This one's a little beat up. I bought it from a guy that did a bunch of touring with it and really rocked out. So, and I added this pink Seymour Duncan. It's an SH8 Invader pickup, and the reason for that is it's very thick, it's very bassy, it's very high output, and it makes this amp, which is a tiny bit more on the thinner side, kind of beef up a little bit more, and I think it sounds, this guitar through this amp does sound particularly good. Before filming this, when I was sort of setting up my equipment, I tried a couple of different guitars, and this was the one that sort of jumped out at me the most for the best kind of sound. And another thing, these amps were really popular with like the punk rock crowd in the 90s, and I think it's sort of because you had this really high amount of gain and you could sort of approximate like a rectifier, not quite really, because there's a lot less bass in this amp than a rectifier has, but it's a very similar like bright cutting tone, which was sort of the in thing at the time, so it's not really a surprise. So starting out on channel A, I'm going to set the gain to about half. And right now I have the, and I'll talk about the EQ a little bit more when we get to the drive channel. I like the way I have it set up for right now. But I have the treble at about 3, the mids at 6, and the bass all the way at 10. The presence is at 3, and I have the reverb just a hair above 2, but I'll flip that on and off as we go. And then the volume is up around 3 on both channels, a little bit higher on this channel because it's just not quite as loud. So we'll sort of start off and see how that sounds. So you could kind of get a little bit of a clean, maybe if you rolled that down a little bit further. It's got some decent dynamics to it, and that's the way that the LEDs clip. It's not quite as immediate of a clipping as like a more traditional diode stage. So, and if it never gets truly clean. So it's a little bit of like a dirty clean. I don't think it really does the plexi thing all that well. if I turn it up a little bit. Let's put it around 7. It actually sounds pretty good. I like channel A lot, actually. And if I turn the gain all the way up, it's definitely got a healthy sort of Marshall crunch to it. And I think if you, and granted I have the treble cut quite a bit to get this sort of tone, but I think if you boost that, I'm going to turn on a tube screamer here. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely got that sort of Marshall bark to it. It's just a little bit of a different flavor to it. And I think if, you know, channel A is kind of the highlight of this amp to me. I really think channel A sounds great. But I will say, if I'm going for that type of tone, I do prefer my JCM900s. And I'm not, you know, trying to sound like a cork sniffer or anything like that. I just prefer they have a little bit more of a low mid grunt to them. And that's just something I like about that 2203 circuit. So now I'm going to jump over to channel B, and we'll hear what that sounds like. There's a button on the front, or you can do it from the foot switch. And I have the reverb turned completely off on this channel for right now, but you can kind of hear what that sounds like. So let's set the gain around half. The halfway point on this is 10, and I'll keep the same EQ so you can hear what that sounds like. It's definitely a fun amp to rock out to. It just has a good sort of like cutting tone. I mean, I think if you're looking for an amp that cuts through the mix, especially if you're in like a really heavy sort of power chord band, you know, that plays stuff like I was just playing there, I think that you would really enjoy this kind of amp, because again, it's like a high output distortion pedal. I mean, they make distortion pedals that have a 12AX7 tube in them, and that's basically what this is. And that's sort of one of the highlights to it, I guess, is you know, whether you love it or you hate it, it is certainly unique. I mean, there's no other Marshall that's quite like this one as far as the circuit. Let me turn that gain down and we'll see how clean channel B can get. So this is with the gain around 4. I've actually never set it this low before, so I don't know what this is going to sound like. Doesn't sound that all that different to when it's at 10, actually. Well, I guess so. It's just, it's hard to tell because the initial tone is still the same. It's mostly just on those palm mutes you can tell that there's a lot less gain. But you're definitely not going to be able to use, and this is kind of a shame actually. I think it would be cool if channel A and B were like the same, and then you could use either or for your different settings, because I would love to use channel A with the gain maxed out like that as my main sort of like crunch tone, and then have channel B be my clean tone or something like that, but it's just not possible on this amp. If you wanted to do that, I guess the only way to do it is to get like a head switcher or something and have a separate clean amp, or try to approximate your channel A tune, a channel A tone on channel B, which you're not really going to be able to pull off just because the channels are so different in design. And one other thing, back to the circuit, channel B has a pre-boost EQ. So if we look at the circuit, I'll circle on the screen where it is. There's actually what looks like a standard treble middle bass setup, but instead of a, instead of having the knobs, like, the pots like you would have on the front of a normal amp, they're fixed values in those sections, which I think is really interesting. I guess that's to shape the sound going in a little bit further. If you're familiar with the design of distortion pedals, that's a really normal thing to do. I mean, pedals like the Boss SD1 and Ibanez Tube Screamer, they cut a lot of bass before the drive stage, and that's on purpose. And this amp works the same way. Just like I said, it's basically a distortion pedal in an amp. All right, so let's turn that gain all the way up so you can hear what it sounds like absolutely maxed out. Yeah, it's definitely a good sound. It's got a lot of that punch to the distortion, and this is with the treble rolled back quite a bit. So I was gonna explain about the EQ. It's very dynamic, this EQ, which I think is another reason why these amps are so popular with modders, is you could tweak a couple of the circuit values and, it does a wider range of sounds depending on how you have it set up. So let's hear with I'm gonna turn the treble from 3 all the way up to 6. And you can just hear what that sounds like. Yeah, I mean, overall, I think I probably would run the bass a little bit lower if I were playing louder. Like there, I did turn it down a little bit, but I like the way the bass fills out the bottom end, especially with the cab that I have, which is a 1960A JCM900 cab with G12 T75s. And then the mids, if I put the mids too far up, they get a little bit cutting, and it's because I think the mid frequency is pretty high. Which is pretty normal for Marshalls, but it can get a little piercing if you take the mids too high. But if you scoop it out, then it starts to sound really dead. So there's definitely a good balance to have there, but it depends on what your other controls are set at. So I really like that mids on 6 and treble down to 3 thing, but I occasionally I keep my other controls basically the same, but then I turn the treble up to basically between 3 and 6, and that's kind of my sweet spot that I like the sound of the most. And obviously, channel B also has reverb. I'll turn it up about halfway. And it can get really excessive, actually. The reverb, the wet mix is very high. All right, so let's hear what this sounds like when I add the jumper. I'm gonna play the same riff and then jumper it and then play the same riff again, and then what I'll do is I'll squeeze the video together so that you don't miss the part where I stand up. So. I'm not sure I can really tell that much of a difference in the room, but when you jumper those effects loops there, you're definitely getting a little bit more of tube in the signal path. You know, if the effects loop is completely disengaged, then the V2A tube isn't even in the signal path at all. So I think maybe that's why people jumper it, but I have to say, sitting here in the room, I don't hear that huge of an audible difference. But maybe the recording will make it a little bit more clear, or maybe if I went and stood a little bit further down the hallway or something like that, I'd be able to tell. But sitting right next to it, it just sounds pretty normal to me. Either way, I hope I demonstrated the tones decently well enough. It's a really, really great amp, and I'm sorry for playing so much mostly punk rock stuff, and it's because I think that's one thing that this amp really, really excels at. I did want to show the Channel B with a boost on it, and I think it really kills for a certain type of like industrial style rock tone that was also pretty big in the 90s. One tone I think really sounds amazing out of this particular amp is the sort of drop tuned chug thing, which the song that always comes to mind for me is Automatic by Powerman 5000. I know that's a way out there song that a lot of people maybe don't know, but there's a riff in that song that just sounds really, really awesome. So I'm gonna go switch guitars really quick so I can demonstrate that riff on a guitar that's actually drop tuned. All right, I'm back. This time I have an ESP Horizon with EMG 81 in the bridge, tuned to drop C, so you can hear what it sounds like with a little bit of down tuning. I have a Ibanez Tube Screamer on right now, but I'll turn it off a little bit later so you can hear what it sounds like unboosted. Right now the gain is right around the, let's put it up to 16. As long as it doesn't feedback, that should be pretty good. All right, thanks for watching and have a good one.